Thank you, Minister, for setting the stage. It's a pleasure to be here, pleasure to be back, pleasure to be allowed to come back to WA. Great to be here, and I appreciate, as Tim was saying as he started, I appreciate particularly NERA as a national organisation, working with State Development WA, working with the Chamber of Commerce, bringing together all the players to explore how do we build a higher value WA. And I want to share with you some examples from around the world. I want to share with you in part what is the logic for cluster engagement. Why are so many countries around the world engaging in a practical way? And then Jacqueline will be picking up after me a little bit on the practice from the Blue Mountain, and I'm sure we'll be hearing from Trish on some of the Geraldton experiences. Is Alison in the room? Alison, acknowledge you as the person who in fact invited me to join you on the journey in Geraldton and to pilot in the WA context a cluster type approach, building on the specializations. As we are meeting here in Perth today with this cluster summit, there's also a meeting going on in Washington. A meeting in Washington that particularly is clusters from across the EU exploring how can they work with, lever with, clusters across the US. How can they build two-way exchanges across the Atlantic? So part of what I want to do in setting the scene here is dig down a bit on, okay, why is the EU? Why is the US? Why are so many countries putting emphasis on the regional specializations and building them? Vestas, a few years ago, moved the head office, a Danish company, moved the head office across Jutland and moved the head office to Aarhus to really be part of the ecosystem in Aarhus, an ecosystem that stands out on a world scale. And Aarhus able to call itself quite proudly the capital of wind energy. I know a number of you have been to Bergen. Bergen able to call itself the global center for subsea technology, accounting for around half the global market. And little Bergen, starting from small beginnings as a service center from the North Sea, but then being very smart about finding ways to add value, finding ways to build local companies that are servicing the North Sea market. So in Bergen today, over 100 companies are part of this subsea activity. It's a naturally occurring cluster. No government agency has invented it. It's come through by market forces. But there is a lot of support in working with this cluster in ensuring that it keeps its position or indeed even moves on in terms of its particular specialization, its niche. And here in Bergen, 10-year support coming from the national government that is matched by local government and others. So Norway saying this process of cluster development, of building on our specializations, is not quick fix. It is long-term and merits long-term support. And part of what the Norwegians are doing is creating an environment where the different players here are able to some extent open their jackets, able to some extent explore where can we lever off each other, where perhaps might we join forces in working in WA or working in Brazil, or where might we join forces in developing some next generation technology. So describing amongst these firms a culture of co-opetition. Yes, these firms fight at times, and that's healthy. But they're also very good at working through where might we lever, where might we join forces. A key element in the Bergen ecosystem is the university, perhaps one of the very few universities in the world where you can go to do a degree in underwater technology, a place that attracts students from around the world and students that often return to their place with a good knowledge of the firms, the competencies that they can draw on from Norway. I've taken you into just one of the Norwegian specializations, their clusters. Each of the dots on this map is another cluster that is being supported by the national agency. If we were to drill down within each of the regions in Norway, we would find other more local clusters. So for Norway, this really is a key part of their economic development agenda, as it is in Sweden. And I want to take you in Sweden up to the top right-hand corner. It's a little place called Luleå, close to the Arctic Circle. It's remote. Remote as many of your communities in WA are remote. Luleå is just south of Kiruna and iron ore mining. What's Luleå smart at? What is its specialization? One is IT for remote mining. And describing this as it's a natural specialization that has evolved out of the businesses, out of the university, out of the TAFE equivalent, out of the ecosystem that Luleå has. The last time I was there, I met a Brazilian student. I asked him, why have you come here? To this place where it's pretty miserable, really. There's snow on the ground for 8-9 months of the year. So why, as a Brazilian, are you here? He said, this is the global hotspot. And learning about IT for remote mining. That's why I'm here. And I hope over time you're developing similar hotspots here in WA where you're attracting attention on a world scale around your specializations. Many people, including The Economist, have admired the way the Scandinavian countries organize themselves for economic development. And one of the keys is the way in which they're engaging at a regional level in working with each region, identifying the specializations and then supporting the ecosystems around those specializations. They're engaging with the traded clusters in each of these communities. The traded clusters being those clusters that are attracting wealth. And the argument is, if you can build the right-hand side of the circle, the traded economy, then automatically the regions are going to need more hairdressers, more automotive repair yards, more house builders, more healthcare professionals. But the starting block in looking at an economy is understanding the traded side, because this is where we find the higher growth firms, this is where we find the higher paying jobs. In Europe today, cluster development is very much on the agenda, with the EU saying to each region, work through what are you really good at, work through what are you darn good at doing, and then come to us for Brussels for support. And if you haven't worked that through, go home, because you need to work that through first. I think the same applies to our regions here in WA, working through what are already our strengths, and then understanding how we engage around them. As the EU puts it here, engaging with clusters helps small businesses as well as larger businesses grow faster, create more jobs, be more innovative, explore new processes, new product development. Some numbers here. 2,500 clusters have been identified across Europe, accounting for 1 in 3 jobs. But this is a key number. Half of European wages. Again, emphasizing this is where the high-value jobs come from. So it's no surprise that we see in a country like France, each region, each department, as they're called, working through what are we good at doing? What are our specializations, and engaging around them. These are clustering initiatives that are funded by Paris. There's a whole host of other clustering initiatives, more regional in scope, that are being funded by the regional governments, the department governments. In a similar way across Germany, each of the Länder, each of the regions, each of the regional governments has got some form of cluster support program in place. There's also in Germany at a national level a Spitzencluster initiative working with the 100 leading global clustering initiatives across Germany. I think, Rick, you've just visited some of these in Munich and perhaps elsewhere. My next bit of the story, and Rick, this is where I went here with Metz to Sudbury, Canada. Sudbury, relatively remote. And what is Sudbury Traditional Mining Centre? Sudbury today calling itself Hard Rock Mining Silicon Valley. A neat descriptor. So it's not mining in general, it's saying our specialization, our competency, our knowledge, particularly about mining in a hard rock environment. It's not just the mines, it's over 100 firms, supply firms, and Canada's largest centre for post-mining, for post-secondary mining education. There's also an industry association here that started from small beginnings with 6 competitors having a beer one evening and saying, you know, together we could put Sudbury more on the world map. We could make things happen together that we can't do separately. Today there's 100 businesses that are part of this association, which is now receiving funding from Ottawa, from Ontario, but also from the local government. A business perspective here. Sudbury was our starting point, but now the world is our oyster. So describing a business here that literally cut its teeth in Sudbury, developed its laurels, established its connections in Sudbury with international mining companies, and has now been able to go on and work with them in different parts of the world. And for the local government saying, we're not dreaming about what we haven't got. What we're doing is understanding what we already have. We're applauding that and now understanding how do we deepen that? How do we take those capabilities further? And how perhaps do we take those capabilities beyond mining into other areas? So describing diversification, and like Minister, your emphasis on diversification this morning, but emphasizing diversification often comes from things that we are already good at doing, rather than coming from left field. I had the opportunity last year to visit the Henderson site. Appreciate it. It's amazing. It stands out. Also had the opportunity last year to be in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And Halifax, going down the track of developing its oceans cluster. And Halifax has a site. It was a naval marine base that's now being transformed into their marine innovation hub. Let me share with you a little bit of the Halifax journey, because certainly they are developing the physical infrastructure, the Marine Innovation Hub, an incubator, a huge marine travel lift being installed. That they are also developing the specialized knowledge infrastructure. There are 4 universities in Halifax. Universities at times, between them the culture is a little bit like this, but finding ways to co-specialize with their competencies. It's the vocational training, even the high schools engage, the R&D, trying to ensure that the international students that come to Halifax stay, because there's high quality jobs that relate to this marine environment. So it's the knowledge infrastructure, but it's also the social infrastructure that they're building. It's the connections. It's developing amongst the firms a culture of co-opetition, creating an environment where firms know enough about each other respect each other as competitors, but can still engage together for larger contracts. Getting, and this is far from easy, getting alignment amongst support organizations, difficult in Canada with 3 tiers of government, difficult for you in Australia too. But these 3 aspects are not equal in complexity. Building the physical infrastructure is the relatively easy bit. It's the relatively quick fix bit. Building the knowledge infrastructure takes longer. Building, for example, the postgraduate programs that support this. Building the social infrastructure, the connections, takes even longer and often takes one heap of alcoholic lubrication. So what Halifax is doing is, yes, it's the physical, but it's also moving beyond that. It is creating the ecosystem to make Halifax truly an oceans cluster. Canada also has a number of cluster programs, particularly across Quebec. The Canadian government is about to announce the details for a $950 million supercluster program. And I'm using this in part to say, hey, this is how other folk are organizing themselves. This is what the Canadians are doing. This is what the Europeans are doing. And if we in Australia, if we in New Zealand, my home country, want to meet this competition, we've got to find other ways to engage. And doing the same that we've always been doing is not going to deliver the preferred future that I sense, Minister, you are talking about. Here's some pieces of evidence on cluster development. First piece relating to prosperity. The stronger a cluster is in a region and the more people are employed in that cluster, the higher the wages, the more the productivity, the more the job growth. Second piece of evidence, entrepreneurship, and enjoyed hearing about this from you this morning, Minister. But entrepreneurs particularly grow and succeed around the key clusters, the key specializations in the region, because that's where the infrastructure is, that is where the support companies are, that is perhaps where the bank managers are that speak the language of that particular sector. So startups and growing businesses particularly emerge from strong clusters. And thirdly, what we see in strong clusters is structural change. Structural change in the sense of a strong cluster is not static. It's not the same forever and a day. There are new things developing, new products, new processes, new things emerging. Again, diversification, naturally growing from the strong clusters. Another way of looking at clusters is this. If you're an international buyer today, the world is becoming a lot easier. If you're a buyer of subsea technology, I would imagine Bergen is first on your list. I'm sorry, I don't think it's Perth. If you're buying something as simple as socks, there's a place in China, Datang. 2,500 sock companies are in this little place, Datang. If you're a buyer of radish seeds, you'd go to Ashburton in the South Island of New Zealand. Or if you're a buyer of an Australian thoroughbred, you'd probably go to Little Scone. That's where 80% of thoroughbred exports for Australia come from. So the world is becoming a lot easier for buyers. And a question then for each of our regions across WA, what are we really good at doing? What really are our specializations? Where might we attract buyers, interstate global buyers? Buyers that pay a premium because we're the knowledge center. And it's no longer a little bit of everything that attracts buyers. It's where we've got some deep, deep competencies. There's an old model of economic development where government calls the shots, with policy decisions incentivizes. There's a newer model where economic development is a collaborative process, where particularly government, businesses, academic institutions, the triple helix, able to work through what are the key issues. Porter, in his work, and I'm drawing on Porter's work here, talks about institutions for collaboration, institutions that improve the lubrication within a region amongst the players. Here's one example of such an institution in Sweden. It's a steel-making cluster way north of Stockholm. They export 91% of the steel that they make, specialty steels. And as the cluster manager describes her role, saying, we act as a junction box. We're a meeting place. And we're also a port for projects, for collaborative projects, projects where it makes sense for companies to combine, to work with other organizations to make new things happen. What this lady is doing in Sweden is accepting that a lot needs to happen within our companies. But where she is focusing is on building the ecosystem, the underpinning, the agendas, the issues, the support infrastructure around the companies within her cluster. Some common characteristics of strong clustering initiatives: diverse stakeholders, at times with a lot of tension, but finding a way to row together, building that regional system. Cluster managers in place, long-term, as connectors, as catalysts. A cluster able to identify its priorities, its roadblocks, its issues, with public agencies responding. So public agencies not in the driving seat, but responding. Active governance, the players, not the spectators. Yesterday, I was in this room, had the pleasure of being here with a group of 25, maybe 30 people that DRD and NERA had pulled together, and taking them through in some detail a process of cluster engagement. How do we move from perhaps a somewhat dysfunctional cluster into a higher performing cluster that's creating high value jobs? We explored in part places like Mackay, again a place I visited, Rick, with your team. And Mackay, without being too unkind, it's a clutter of solitary firms. The culture amongst those firms on the whole like this. As they come to meetings, they're sitting sideways at the table. Okay, some supply chain links, but it's not an open system. It's a clumps of firms, and it's a clutter of support agencies. And a clutter of support agencies, it would be generous to say they have different agendas. Often they have competing agendas. And part of cluster development is getting the bulldozer out. It's getting firms appreciate that, yeah, we compete, but we can also, if we can develop a bit of trust and knowledge about each other, find ways to collaborate. It's moving from a clutter of support to integrated support, that particularly where the support agencies can listen to the needs of businesses. It's moving in the sense of building our regional economy from thinking about perhaps 2 or 3 standalone ocean liners, 2 or 3 perhaps major investors that we're seeking to attract into our region. It's moving from that to thinking about, hey, what about 1,000 speedboats? And 1,000 speedboats that are linked and able to lever off each other, and 1,000 specialized speedboats with deep competencies. Cluster development, as we were sharing over the 2 days, is very much about understanding our regional specializations. It's about respecting them and digging deeper. It's understanding in a Geraldton that, wow, this is where 85% of Australia's winter cucumbers come from. Okay, there is a comparative advantage there in terms of the soil, the climate, I guess. There is a competitive advantage there, but now comes the third layer. There's a collaborative advantage being built. We're now for the first time, and Trish, I hope you'll talk a bit about this, now for the first time, competitors are sitting together and working through where are their common agendas. So describing here cluster development in a practical sense. It's about building the bridges. It's about moving from solo players to building that ecosystems. It's about linking, as I see across Europe, showing here aerospace clusters, some 34 separate aerospace clusters that at times compete with each other, but also levering their different knowledge, their competencies, particularly to engage globally. And that's why we see meetings such as the meeting going on in Washington today, linking across the Atlantic some of the leading clusters in Europe and the leading clusters in the US. At the moment, here in Australia, here in WA, we're not part of those types of discussions. That's a missed opportunity. Thank you for your time.